In this lecture, we are going to talk about descending motor pathways. The first thing we need to understand is what are upper and lower motor neurons. So let's define them. A lower motor neuron is a motor neuron that directly innervates a muscle fiber. These are the motor neurons that are going to have their axons in the peripheral nervous system going out and innervating the muscle cell. When we have damage to the lower motor neuron, we're not sending action potentials to the motor unit. And so we will see a flaccid type or hypotonic type of paralysis or paresis. And paresis is really just a partial paralysis. If you completely damage the peripheral nerve, for instance, you would have paralysis of the muscle. If you damage some of the neurons within that nerve, but not all, then you will have paresis because some motor units are still able to fire. The upper motor neuron is a motor neuron within the central nervous system that controls the activity of the lower motor neuron. These upper motor neurons start in the brain or the brainstem and drive the lower motor neuron activity. They are completely within the central nervous system. Their axons never leave the central nervous system and enter the peripheral nervous system. Damage to upper motor neurons is most often associated with a spastic type of paralysis or rigidity, as opposed to a flaccid type. There will be occasions where you may have someone with an upper motor neuron injury who demonstrates a persistent flaccid type of paralysis. But that is much less common, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the brain and where we are likely to see this type of a presentation. In the last lecture, I gave a little bit of an analogy of thinking about these neurons as child and parents. And I think that's kind of a good analogy to use. Whether you want to think of the lower motor neuron as being a young child, or you want to think of the lower motor neuron as being a college-age child, the analogy still, I think, works. So if you have the young child and the parents are away at the moment, the young child is likely to go a little crazy and, start overacting and acting up until the parents are able to provide that guidance. And similarly, when that college student first leaves home and is no longer supervised by the parents, the red cup is likely to come out and it's time to party. And that child becomes, overly active, as it were. That's kind of my analogy when it comes to the spasticity. There's too much activity in the lower motor neuron, and as a result in the muscle, because the upper motor neurons are not present or not able to provide the guidance to the lower motor neuron to have appropriate behavior. The descending pathways from the brain and brainstem can be thought of as being medial or lateral activation systems. The medial activation system helps to control gross motor, while the lateral helps to control fine motor. Our medial activation system controls the trunk and proximal limb muscles. It's important for posture and balance, as well as preparation for movement. Before you can reach up to get something, you need to shift your body weight and adjust your shoulder girdle and your pelvic girdle muscle activity prior to actually lifting the arm and moving the body forward in order to prevent loss of balance and to have a smooth, controlled movement of the limb. This would be the responsibility of our gross motor system. Our lateral activation system or fine motor system, while it controls all muscles of the body, is especially important for the distal limbs. The hands, the foot, and ankle are particularly under control of the lateral activation system. According to your textbook, the medial activating system contains 6 tracts. Some authors will say one of these tracts is actually more of a lateral activating system tract, and I'll discuss that briefly. The 6 tracts, though listed by your text as being in the medial activating system, are the tectospinal tract, the anterior corticospinal tract, sometimes called the medial corticospinal tract, the medial and lateral vestibulospinal tracts, and the medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts. These tracts are named for where they start and where they end. So you can see they all end in the word spinal. That tells you that they all go down to the spinal cord. The first part of the word is telling you where they start. There is an area of the midbrain, or mesencephalon, in its most posterior aspect that is called the tectum. So this is the starting point of the tectospinal tract. Cortico means cortex, so the anterior corticospinal tract is going to start in the cortical area of your brain. The vestibulospinal tracts start in the vestibular nuclei of the brainstem. These are nuclei associated with our vestibular system. And there's an area in your brainstem called the reticular formation. So the reticulospinal tracts start in the reticular formation. As I mentioned, some will consider one of these tracts to be more of the lateral activating system, and that's the lateral reticulospinal tract. Because functionally, this tract ends in the lateral part of the spinal cord, and it does seem like it acts more to control finer movements as opposed to being focused on gross movements. We're going to go through these different tracts now individually. The tectospinal tract, as I mentioned, originates in the midbrain in what's called the tectum, specifically in the superior colliculus. And we'll talk about the superior colliculus in our next unit when we talk about the brainstem in more detail. Tectospinal tract comes down and ends essentially in the cervical spinal cord. Its main role is orientation of the head to an auditory or visual stimulus. So you hear something and you turn towards it, or you see something and you look towards it, and so you move your head towards these stimuli. So that's the primary purpose of tectospinal. The anterior or medial corticospinal tract starts in the cerebral cortex and goes down to the spinal cord ipsilaterally. Once in the spinal cord, many neurons do cross to innervate contralaterally as well as ipsilaterally. And this makes sense when we understand that the anterior corticospinal tract assists with control of the trunk and proximal limb muscles, particularly in the area of the neck and shoulders. Many times you need bilateral control of these muscles when you're dealing with posture and preparation for movement. This tract is an important one when we are about to move, in making sure that we have made the postural corrections and stabilized the shoulder girdle prior to actually moving the rest of the limb. The anterior corticospinal tract makes up somewhere around 10 or 20% of the motor neurons that start in the motor cortices area of the brain and travel down to the spinal cord. The majority of the neurons that start in the motor cortices are actually going to be in the lateral corticospinal tract, which we will talk about shortly. The medial and lateral vestibulospinal tracts start in the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem. These nuclei are getting information from our inner ear and are important in equilibrium and balance. The tracts are partially crossed, so when taking medial and lateral vestibulospinal tracts together, they control the trunk and girdle muscles, particularly the pelvic girdle region, bilaterally. They help us to maintain our center of gravity over our base of support. The reticulospinal tracts start in a network of nuclei within the brainstem called the reticular formation. This is a rather large network that runs the length of the brainstem and is made up of several different nuclei. The medial reticulospinal tract starts in the pons, while the lateral starts in the medulla. The function of these tracts, particularly the medial, is posture and gross limb movements. The lateral appears to also be involved with rhythmical patterns of activity and may be responsible for activating the central pattern generators involved with gait. Both tracts appear to inhibit flexor reflexes. The lateral reticulospinal tract does act probably more like a lateral system, activating system, as opposed to a medial activating system, in that it also is involved with inhibition of phasic and tonic stretch reflexes. So it's involved with maintaining control over the deep tendon reflex. And it seems that it can help with return of function to the more distal limbs, with the exception of the hand, ankle, and foot following injury to the other lateral tracts. So it's kind of an in-between tract in that it's involved with these rhythmical patterns of movement involving around the pelvic girdle, so more proximal, and it does help to control proximal limb movement, but it also extends to helping to control movement down through the distal limb with the exclusion of the hand and foot. The lateral reticulospinal tract, because of its effect on the stretch reflexes, is likely involved in the development of spasticity and hyperreflexia, but its exact role has not yet been fully delineated. The lateral activation system involves two tracts, the rubrospinal tract and the lateral cortical spinal tract, also known as the pyramidal tract. The rubrospinal tract is going to start in an area of the midbrain called the red nucleus. You might have heard of the term or seen the term in your medical records of rubor. Rubor means red. When we look at the brains in the lab, excuse me, this nucleus is not going to look red. It's going to look like the other nuclei of the brain. But in a non-fixed or non-formaldehyde-filled brain, it has a little bit of a different color appearance, I believe, and that is why it got that name. So this tract starts in the midbrain, crosses over contralaterally to the other side, and helps to facilitate muscles of the limbs, particularly like the elbow and wrist, knee area. Excuse me. It gets input from the brain to help control its activity. It is possibly small in humans and not having a whole lot of functional significance. But this is quite controversial because the red nucleus is actually very large. So it doesn't make sense that you'd have this huge nucleus but have very little impact or function. So there's quite a bit of controversy here. So at this point, what I want you to understand is that the rubrospinal tract originates in the midbrain, and it is involved with initiation of movement, particularly in the more distal parts of the limb, or no, not so much with the hands and feet. The most important tract that we're going to be talking about throughout the semester is the lateral cortical spinal tract. The lateral cortical spinal tract starts in the cortex and ends in the spinal cord. It crosses on its way down at the base of the medulla. So if it's starting on the right side of our brain, it's going to travel down through the brain and brainstem on the right side. And at the bottom of the medulla, where the medulla and the spinal cord come together, that would be the spinomedullary junction. It's going to cross to the contralateral side and then innervate lower motor neurons on the contralateral side of the body. It innervates all skeletal muscles and is the most important one for us to know and understand. A critical feature of this tract, and this is the only tract that can do this, it allows for fractionation. Fractionation is the ability to contract muscles independent of other muscles. So you can contract a muscle without having to contract all of its synergists. Instead of making a fist, we can flex a single digit. Now, we've got some limitations because the way the tendons are hooked together. But you can, straighten up, let's say, your index finger and not extend the other digits of your hand. You can extend your pinky finger and not extend the other digits of your hand. The reason we can move our fingers independently of each other is because of this particular tract and its ability to have fractionated movement. It also allows for more independent movement in the foot and ankle. When there is injury to this particular tract, in many cases we will see a rudimentary reflex return, and this is called the Babinski sign. When you stroke the bottom of the foot, so you would take, let's say, the handle of a reflex hammer, stroke the lateral side of the sole of the foot, and then sweep it around on the ball of the foot under the metatarsal heads, you will see the big toe extend. And oftentimes you might see movement of the kind of flaring of the other toes as well. But that is the Babinski sign. And that is normal in infants. But it should become inhibited after I believe it's around 6 months of age or so. But with individuals who have had damage to this tract, the Babinski sign will often reappear. The cell body for the lateral cortical spinal tract is located in the primary motor cortex. This is located on the precentral gyrus. So there's this central sulcus, which separates our frontal lobe from our parietal lobe. On the front side of that sulcus is a gyrus or a ridge, and that's the precentral gyrus. And the cortex on that gyrus is the primary motor cortex. The axon then runs down, and as I said, it crosses over at the inferior aspect of the medulla oblongata. And the place that it crosses is called the pyramidal decussations. On the front of the medulla are two bumps, one on either side of midline. And those bumps are called the pyramids. And that's why this tract is called the pyramidal tract, because it runs down through the pyramids. Decussate means to cross. So pyramidal decussations just means the crossing of the axons from the pyramids. Another thing that's interesting about this tract is that all of the other descending motor tracts I've been talking about act on lower motor neurons indirectly. They synapse on interneurons that then impact the lower motor neurons. The lateral cortical spinal tract, however, directly synapses on lower motor neurons. It also synapses on interneurons, but most importantly, it has direct connections to our alpha motor neurons. Now let's go ahead and draw out the lateral cortical spinal tract. This is the only one that I'm going to ask you to draw of our descending motor tracts. We're going to start in the primary motor cortex. We have a motor homunculus just as we had a sensory homunculus, and they look almost identical. So our legs are going to be represented more medially by the longitudinal fissure, and our face is going to be more lateral, more towards the lateral sulcus. We're now going to be starting in the frontal lobe instead of the parietal lobe. The axon is going to come down lateral to our thalamus and then travel down anteromedially through the brainstem. It's going to go right along on one side of our center line of our medulla there, cross at the very bottom of that line, and then come out in the spinal cord on the opposite side. So when we draw it in, it looks something like the following picture. And here it is. So this is going to a lower extremity. I have chosen rectus femoris to be my muscle that's being innervated here. So my upper motor neuron in the lateral cortical spinal tract has its cell body in the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe. Because I'm looking at a lower extremity, I'm more medially located by the longitudinal fissure. The axon travels lateral to the thalamus, comes down medially through the brainstem, crosses right at the bottom of the medulla where it joins in with the spinal cord. And then you can see where the tract is located in the spinal cord. It's kind of tucked in that little indentation there by the dorsal horn. It then enters the ventral horn where we have a direct synapse on our lower motor neuron, our alpha motor neuron, which is traveling in the femoral nerve to innervate our rectus femoris muscle. I've also included the fact that this is an L3 spinal cord, and I know that because that is a myotome for rectus femoris. So it could be L3 or L4, but we know that it's going to be in that area. This would not be higher up, nor would it be, let's say, S1. That would be too low for a rectus muscle. So again, the primary motor cortex has a motor homunculus. It lies just anterior to our central sulcus. Like the primary somatosensory cortex, the primary motor cortex is regionally specific. It has this body representation on the cortex. We see neuroplasticity here just as we would in the primary somatosensory cortex. Previously, I mentioned the difference between paralysis and paresis, so just a reminder, paralysis is a complete loss of voluntary control of muscle. It does not mean that the muscle is not contracting. In spastic paralysis, the muscle has significant tension and developed within it and a great deal of resistance to passive stretch, but it's not voluntary. So paralysis is the complete loss of voluntary control, while paresis would be partial loss. I want you to brainstorm what you think would happen to voluntary control with injuries to these various locations. The lower motor neuron, the spinal cord, if we've damaged the area of the lower motor neuron, the spinal cord, if we are inferior, or if the injury, I should say, is superior to an area of the lower motor neuron, and an injury to the upper motor neuron somewhere above the spinal cord. So throw your ideas out on the discussion board and let's have a good discussion. And then just to mention a couple of pathologies. Lower motor neuron lesions are associated with pronounced and marked atrophy. This usually comes on quickly. This is because of the loss of ACH going to that muscle, in addition to the fact that the muscle is not contracting, so the proteins begin to break down. Upper motor neuron lesions, on the other hand, typically show little atrophy or a slow onset and progression of that atrophy. It's not rapid and marked like it is in lower motor neurons. It's much more slow in its progression. And this is because the muscle is still getting ACH. So it's maintaining that health. And oftentimes, if we have a spastic type of paralysis, we have contraction of the muscle. We have tension in the muscle. And as a result, we have less of that breakdown of the proteins that make up the muscle. I don't want you to right now try and know, okay, which disease is an upper motor neuron, which is a lower motor neuron, which is mixed. These are just examples to give you some ideas. What I do want you to know, though, is the association of atrophy with lower motor neuron lesion and little or very slow progression of atrophy for upper. But to give you some ideas of different types of lesions, polio is a lower motor neuron lesion. The polio virus, for whatever reason, attacks lower motor neuron cell bodies. It has limited effect on sensory neurons. I don't know why, I can't explain that, but it seems to focus its attack on motor and lower motor specifically. Some causes of upper motor neuron lesions include strokes or cerebral vascular accidents, cerebral palsy, spinal cord injuries that are going to affect that lateral cortical spinal tract. Excuse me. That will affect everything below the level of the injury, and tumors. Mixed types of lesions that involve both upper and lower motor neurons include things like ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. This affects both our upper and lower motor neurons, so you see kind of a mixture in your findings. Sensory, again, for whatever reason, tends to be relatively spared. That's the end of our lecture for week 5 on our descending motor tracts.